Again, I'm John Jacobs with the Center for Financial Markets and Policy. This is our panel on regulatory and policy environment. We have a great panel, a great group of panelists here. And as usual, I'll do an introduction. We'll have a great conversation, and then we'll set some time aside for audience Q&A. I'm just going to introduce our panelists by name and firm, and then let them do a quick introduction for themselves. So I'll start with, immediately to my left is Stephanie Dumont, Senior Vice President at FINRA. And then, there he is, Donald C. Langevoort. He's the Thomas Aquinas Reynolds Professor of Law here at Georgetown University Law Center. Then is Dan Crowley, who's a partner at K&L Gates. Joel Oswald, a Senior Partner of Financial Services at Williams Jensen. And Margaret Paulsen, Senior Managing Director, Financial Services Risk and Regulatory at PwC. So, Stephanie, we'll start with you. Just a quick self-introduction.
Sure. So I work for FINRA, and our CEO, Robert Cook, has already spoken to the group, so I won't go into a lot of detail about FINRA. But I am in the regulatory policy group of our Office of General Counsel, and my area of focus is trading and markets. So our group handles the rulemaking and policy in the trading areas, market reg, order handling, all the NMS plans. So that's my area of focus.
Great, thank you.
I'm Don Langevoort from Georgetown. I'm a law professor, so I have no deep knowledge into the real workings of how things go, but I'm a real good theorist. My specialty is compliance, enforcement, and litigation, so often the back end of the policy when things get out of hand. But I started out at the SEC, became an academic, and have been an academic for about 35 years.
Great, thank you.
I'm Dan Crowley. I'm a partner at the law firm of K&L Gates. If you're not familiar with K&L, it was created by the merger of Kirkpatrick and Lockhart, an East Coast firm with European practice, and Preston Gates Ellis, a West Coast firm with Asia practice. When we linked them together, it created a 2,000-lawyer law firm in 46 offices on 5 continents. I lead the global financial services policy practice. I will say about 1,950 of our colleagues are focused on the law as it exists and how to comply with it. The other 50 of us in the public policy group are thinking about how the law can be changed and how we can influence it.
Joel Oswald with Williams Jensen. We're a much smaller law firm, which is actually more of a lobbying firm than a traditional law firm. So our primary business is in the lobbying and government affairs arena. We span lots of different practice areas. I'm in the financial service practice area, do a lot of securities-related work, kind of got my introduction at the firm anyway in that space just prior to Reg NMS, so seen a lot of changes since then. But I also work with a lot of clients in the insurance, reinsurance, even consumer finance and banking space as well.
Hi, Margaret Paulsen, Senior Managing Director at PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC. My focus areas are risk and regulatory in the financial services space. I create compliance or risk management solutions. I also focus on cyber and privacy, which, as we all know now, it really is one big area with blurred lines in between. Separately at PwC, I'm responsible for an initiative called Digital Me at PwC, which is part of helping our workforce reinvent themselves for the digital era. So I know that that's also been a theme throughout today, so I figured I'd mention that as well.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to start off, and so there's been a lot of conversation today, and everything from the very beginning about what's wrong with the markets, how to fix them, different ideas, the capital markets, IPOs, et cetera. So Stephanie, I thought I'd start with you and ask you to kind of walk us through your view of the evolution of how the SEC has been handling, and just in general rulemaking. I know there's a lot of parties involved. It's SEC, the NMS plans, SRO rules, et cetera. And so, I'm not sure everyone really is up to speed on how that's all kind of works and how it's kind of evolved the last couple of years. So why don't you just kind of lay the groundwork for us?
Yeah. Absolutely. So the SEC has a variety of ways to effectuate their policy agenda. They have direct rulemaking authority. They can amend their rules. They can do new rules. They can look to the SROs to do NMS plans, and you heard a lot of talk today about NMS plans, particularly CAT, limit up, limit down, tick size. Those are all NMS plans, and And an NMS plan is when the SROs, the exchanges and FINRA, act jointly to effectuate a particular initiative, and they file a plan with the SEC. It goes through the rulemaking process, and once it's approved, they all operate together jointly. And then the third common way is just the SROs can do their own rules, and those apply to their members, and oftentimes the SEC might encourage SROs to do particular rulemaking in an area. So if you look back, which I thought was kind of an interesting thing, to look back at Chair White's speech from 2014, she actually had put together in her speech a pretty ambitious agenda for the SEC in the equity market structure area. I think there were at least 15 different initiatives that she spoke about in that speech. And she used all three of the tools I just talked about, her own SEC rulemaking, NMS plans, SRO rulemaking to try to effectuate all the different things that she wanted to do. And if you did a quick breakdown of it, about half of the 15 were SEC rulemaking, and maybe about a quarter of them actually were completed. Several of them were proposed, but never actually have yet made it over the finish line, and then several of them didn't even make the proposal stage. So SEC rulemaking is not simple. There's a lot to it and a lot to make its way through the entire process. NMS plans, I think she referenced 3 or 4, and all of those were at least completed and are active in in their pilots. The limit up, limit down, tick size, CAD is underway. And then SRO rulemaking, she spoke about a number of those, and one was algo trader registration and qualification. That has been completed. You can use a variety of these tools, the SEC can, to get their policy agenda over the finish line. And which one they decide to use it really just depends. I think the access fee pilot is a good example of where they've thought about whether it should be SEC rulemaking or should it be an NMS plan. And you tend to see where there's more competitive or commercial aspects related to the particular initiative. They may find an NMS plan more challenging, and they may be more likely to do that via direct rulemaking. And I think we're seeing that with the access fee pilot, is that from at least the indicators from the SEC side, that they'll probably do that via direct SEC rulemaking, but we'll see.
So they have a lot of tools in the tool chest.
Yep.
So on that point, President Langevoort, maybe you could talk a little bit about, as Jim mentioned in the last panel, the Bitcoin ETF is a good example of how it's just been withdrawn. And there's a lot of fits and starts in that particular area. It seems like sometimes, and I don't say this in a negative way, but it's like the SEC sometimes gets in over its head on certain issues. Is that a way to look at it or think about it?
Yeah, and there's a long history of the SEC coming to regulatory tasks without having built the staff expertise that it takes to be confident that you're hitting the right level of balance between making sure there's space for innovation and space for growth and all the things that our markets depend on, and at the same time have your finger on the places that, on the pulse that could go dead, where you're going to have to get involved. Yeah, that was certainly true in the lead up to the financial crisis with respect to the SEC all of a sudden having investment bank capital regulation dumped on its lap. It's certainly true now with blockchain type products. I don't think the SEC is internalized an expertise there. They have people who know, they're talking to people. The SEC most recently did something that I think was probably right in dealing with its first major Bitcoin issue. It simply issued what's called a 21A report, which is not to take enforcement action, even though the 21A report creates grounds on which somebody might go forward, but rather set a framework that I think was clearly designed to say there's a pathway we'd rather you take. You don't have to take it right now, but be aware that we're watching. So that go slow approach is how you deal with a staff that is still low on the learning curve. You don't take precipitous action. You let things develop but you let people know you're there.
So Dan, how does, not just in this current environment, but in general, how does Congress play into this SEC process right now?
Well, that's a very good question. So much of the SEC's regulatory agenda was handed to it by Congress in the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act of 2010. And it's important to remember that prior to Dodd-Frank, these financial services policy issues were not inherently partisan. In fact, the last major bill before Dodd-Frank, Sarbanes-Oxley, Paul Sarbanes is a Democrat, Mike Oxley a Republican. What the Democrats had to do in response to the credit crisis was to try to revisit all of the financial services law from the 1864 National Bank Act through Sarbanes-Oxley in a 14-month period. And there's no way to cover that much ground effectively legislatively, so they punted, and they gave regulators, including the SEC, unprecedented discretion and a huge number, I think it was a total of 417 rulemakings and studies that they had to do. And so this is, sort of mid-implementation, and then we have the 2016 election, and the, tide shifts entirely. We have unified Republican control of government. None of them in the House voted for Dodd-Frank, only 3 in the Senate, only one of whom is still there. So you have a sea change in the philosophical orientation toward these rulemakings. And we're now seeing that coupled with the Treasury reports, the capital markets report. And so you seem to have this sort of kumbaya around repealing and replacing Dodd-Frank. But I think it's important to keep in mind 2 things. One is that the policy process is inherently incremental. And even the Republicans in the House who have passed the Financial Choice Act, which is a wholesale rewrite of Dodd-Frank, don't revisit the 2 fundamental things that Dodd-Frank did. One was to separate the consumer protection function from bank regulation, and the second was to correct the bipartisan policy failure from the 2000 law that exempted swaps from regulation in Title VII of Dodd-Frank. That cornerstone of Dodd-Frank remains intact. So by definition, everything we're doing from this point forward is incremental change. I think Jay Clayton, and I know you've got Mike Piwowar here to talk next, but clearly their focus is on capital formation, rekindling IPOs, trying to, get the, uncaging the animal spirits, if you will. And so I think it's safe to say that the new leadership of the SEC has sympathetic overseers on Capitol Hill, and while they're not going to completely dismantle Dodd-Frank, they are going to be allies in revisiting a lot of the regulation that was reflexive in response to the credit crisis. The one other point to make is that there is now a permanent international dimension to domestic policymaking, because one of the consequences of the credit crisis was to create new agencies, CFPB, the FSOC, right, which is sort of a statutory codification of the President's Working Group on Capital Markets. But in Europe, we have European Securities Market Association, which did not exist. They're having their annual conference on Tuesday. Basel Committee has taken on much more importance. The Financial Stability Board is new. It's sort of the international parallel to the FSOC. And those international, and IOSCO, of course, in Madrid. So those international regulatory bodies are going to have influence on domestic policymakers going forward. And so it's become a sort of a 3-dimensional chess game.
Great, thank you. So Joe, Dan mentioned Treasury. Treasury made a big announcement recently, so do you want to share a little bit about that and some insights?
Yeah, so it's, of course, I think everybody here has seen the reports about it, the second report responding to the executive order on core principles of financial regulation. It's something that I'd say, just stepping back a little bit, just in terms of looking at the executive order. It's kind of an opportunity, I think, for this new administration to do a little, you could call it tone setting, or and also really the first comprehensive look at our rules since the financial crisis. So that's, I think, some of the purposes of the executive order. And stemming from that, they've broken them out, these reports from Treasury, into 4 different topics. The first was banks and credit unions. This one on Friday was on the capital markets. It got into a lot of different areas, everything from derivatives to equity market structure to capital formation, as Dan mentioned, is a big topic that the SEC, of course, is focused on as well. So it's some way to kind of signal to the regulators, of course, these are some areas that you should focus on, kind of gets everybody on knowing where the administration is coming from at least, even though some of these entities implementing or regulators are independent regulators. So it will be interesting to see what actually ultimately comes out through regulation, how much of the report actually becomes implemented through regulation, because that's a process. For instance, at the SEC, Chairman Clayton has already identified a couple areas in market structure and capital formation. In market structure, some things were actually in the report that he had already identified as something it seems like on the fairly near term he wants to move forward with, like an access fee pilot, order handling disclosures, Rule 605, 606, and ATS disclosures. So some of the things that came from the Equity Market Structure Advisory Committee are also in that report. So it will be interesting to see if that's something, assuming the advisory committee is actually extended. I will assume it will be, but I don't know for a fact. Do they take up some of these issues? There are some pretty big issues in there too, in the equity market side. The market data issue, which was visited. There was a comprehensive study, I think it was in 99 or 2000.
Yes.
And so this is something that's been, especially in recent years, but really since then, been talked about, and it does have impacts on market structure because of your best execution obligations and order handling rules. Makes market participants feel like they have to really buy, in most cases, depth of book market data.
Which they feel they contribute to and they should own part of. I suffered
Correct.
that really hard battle
Correct.
many times, so yeah.
Yeah.
That's a very complex issue. I know
Correct,
as well, right?
correct. So they tackle that in a way that, that's an issue that MSAC had been on their agenda, but haven't seen anything come from that yet. So do they actually now start to, does the committee actually start to look at market data, for instance? But there's a lot of other issues in there too that we can go into.
So Margaret, you've been on PwC 7 years now, switching over from the legal side. So these conversations we're having, how are the conversations with your clients changed? Or how are they, like when Treasury comes out with this release, did your phone start ringing? What are they thinking about? What are they focused on when they see this environment that they're dealing with now? So
that's a great question. So I think we've gone from the information overload of Dodd-Frank to the information overload of the new administration. Right. And it's really always with our clients, what we do is we help them operationalize a solution or improve a process or make a process more efficient and whatever it takes to continue to compete. And so the laser focus up until January this year was how to manage the regulatory environment, how to put a program in place that allowed you to consume, implement, and efficiently understand so that you have a compliant staff and compliant operations. That still exists, and it's still quite important, but now it's trying to figure out, wait a minute, is something going to get peeled back in the United States? Who's going to peel it back? Is it coming from the Hill? Our view is pretty much no, it's not. We're not going to see, in our view, a lot of Dodd-Frank reform go through. We see little tweaks and traps, but especially now since the Hill has turned its attention full on other issues. And by the Hill, I mean the financial services committees. Is it coming from the regulators? The answer is it depends. We've got a roadmap from Treasury. It's an interesting roadmap, a lot of low-hanging fruit that they've plucked, things underway, things that that you want to see underway. There is, when it comes to clearinghouse, there's a recommendation of more authority for the regulators, which had all our eyebrows go up in the deregulatory environment. Is it coming from the states? So where the federal regulators let up, the state regulators have decided, oh, not us, New York. DFS came out quite aggressively when the administration changed and said, we're going to still hold the line on these very important pieces. So for our clients, it's consuming the new environment. Our conversations are really around risk, because risk is the umbrella underneath which you put everything. So you put risk compliance, risk cyber, risk privacy. And are your programs in place for identifying, managing, and mitigating risk robust, or are there areas of improvement?
Right. So this next question I'm going to throw out there, everyone should answer, but you guys pick who wants to answer first. And I'll ask it this way. So FSOC recently removed AIG, right? And the recent designation AIG is a systemically important non-bank. Was that just a unique thing? Is there something we should read into it? Whatever. You're shaking your head already, Dan. Go.
I think trying to cram non-banks into a bank regulatory model ended on election day. We're just seeing the consequences play out of that. There's been, since 2008, late 2007, a profound tug of war between competing regulatory ideologies, the bank regulatory safety and soundness mindset in which risk is the enemy on the one hand, and the traditional capital markets paradigm in which informed assumption of risk is essential to efficient allocation of capital. And we've seen that dynamic play out, and for the better part of the last decade, the bank regulators have been winning. But what we saw, not just in the US election, but also in Brexit, was a profound sense of economic dislocation resulting in reassertions of national sovereignty. And so I think the pendulum is swinging back in favor of the capital markets regulatory paradigm, and we'll see the implications of that in the years ahead.
Another way of putting that is the most important word in this whole discussion is growth. What does it take to get our capital markets to deliver the kind of growth that responds to the anxiety, the angst that you're talking about? Certainly, Economics 101 teaches you that growth comes with risk. They run together. So I think what you're saying, and I agree with you completely, is in the last year, our growth appetite grew considerably, and so did our risk appetite. And that's what's going to be interesting to see play out on all the dimensions you were describing. How much are we going to be willing to take on if infrastructure investment, the trillion-dollar projects, start being securitized? How is that going to fit into our risk appetite? But I agree completely. That's where the agenda is moving now.
And I guess bank regulators were winning. They got tired of winning. But on a serious note, though, it's a good question. One thing just an observation is it was bipartisan in terms of who the appointee regulators were who voted for the designation. There were still some that disagreed with that. But it's something also I think that kind of previews, it was first of all a very data-driven approach in terms of the rescission. There were a lot of dots in there, by the way, that redacted information, so you don't know everything that's in there. But you also have, the FSOC report that's supposed to come out later this year. It's a presidential memorandum that required Treasury to study the FSOC and its processes. So that, I think we'll see obviously more firm answers at that point when that report comes out, probably later this year.
Want to weigh in, or?
I do want to weigh in. I do. Fair disclosure, my husband is chief legal counsel at AIG for this particular matter. So very interesting. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, if I could just sort of follow on that, the problems at AIG had nothing to do with the regulation of insurance, right? If you ask each of us what the causes of the credit crisis were, you're going to get 5 different answers. My view is that the single biggest contributor, at least to the magnitude of the crisis, was the bipartisan failure to regulate swaps in 1999. The Commodity Futures Modernization Act explicitly exempted swaps from regulation on the grounds that, and full disclosure, I was at NASD at the time and was part of the chorus saying these are complicated products being traded between sophisticated counterparties, and if we try to regulate them, it's going to drive all the trading offshore. Let's not regulate them. I, at the time, had never heard of a credit default swap. And so we had no idea that it would create this $65 trillion notional value house of cards that ultimately came crashing down. And that's the fundamental reason why there is an implicit bipartisan understanding that Title VII of Dodd-Frank is the law of the land and is not going to be revisited. But to my way of thinking, designating AIG for macroprudential supervision by the Federal Reserve, in a sense laying this safety and soundness regulatory overview, was totally misguided. And so I'm very glad to see that the designation has been rescinded, and it soon should be for the others. And frankly, AIG sort of capitulated on the front end, along with GE Capital, which of course no longer exists. And I don't think that's good for capitalism or for the US markets.
I think, though, you're raising the Title VII derivatives reform is really fascinating. If you take a step back from the everyday, which we don't often get an opportunity to, Title VII reform, which is regulation of derivatives in the United States under Dodd-Frank, is holding. Nobody's having a serious conversation about repealing it. The CFTC is having a very serious conversation about streamlining the rules and getting the rules right. But even in the pendulum swing back to a deregulatory environment, the CFTC, which is the lead regulator right now in this space, is not recommending repeal. And the Treasury report is recommending that the SEC proceed with regulation, which was another kind of eyebrow raiser when we read that. And so the question kind of comes to mind if you want to take a step back. So why is that? What are the forces? So obviously the market forces and the market reaction, but also the implementation. How did those reforms come into play? Well, the answer is that the G20 came up with core principles for regulating global derivatives markets, which include about 8 features that have now gone around the global derivatives markets. So as we all know, those markets follow the sun, right? I'm a trader, I go to sleep, London wakes up, they take my book. And, or maybe I got my world backwards, but sorry. So the rollout, having been, the observer, I watched that revolution, I ran a lot of those projects, and how do you operationalize this global reform? Well, you don't take your trading system and bolt on a new solution just for London. You take your trading system and you bolt on a new solution for the G20 reform that's in place, whether it's how you trade, execution, clearing, reporting, and now we're seeing a lot of the necessary improvements come into play. But the unscrambling those eggs and taking it back, even if there were consensus that that's a good idea, and I think there's not, it's simply not a discussion that's underway.
So who's driving the agenda for the regulatory agenda? Who's driving that today?
In the U.S.?
In the U.S. And
I would have to say it's the White House, the commander-in-chief. Make America great again. And he's doing it in large part through personnel and the people he's appointing to the agencies.
To the agencies. Yeah. So it's the executive branch through the agencies as opposed to Congress through the...
Yeah, I agree. Congress is, dysfunctional. Is that a polite way of putting it? Let's see if they can get consensus on tax reform. I agree that Dodd-Frank is not going to be wholesale rewrite. But I think there will be changes. You know, Crapo and Brown are working on sort of bipartisan agreement. But I think you're going to see a lot more change. And getting back to your point about growth, I think, you know, since the election, we've seen a pretty dramatic uptick in equities. And at first, I thought it was a relief rally that we didn't go the other way, this sort of, you know, socialist kumbaya emanating from Brussels, right? Which was the same dynamic that led to Brexit. Let's face it, Bernie Sanders would be a centrist in Brussels. And if your policy is being determined in Brussels and Basel, it creates sort of this one-size-fits-all approach that we're now sort of recovering from. But just taking away that sort of oppressive global regulatory overlay has, as I say, uncaged the animal spirits, and we're seeing that most directly in the markets.
Joel, you want to?
Just add, Dan mentioned one size fits all, and that is a constant theme we're hearing. It was in the Treasury report. Mm-hmm. It's something we've heard on the coming from the Hill as well, and in the equity market structure space as well, relating to the size of companies and maybe how they trade. So that is something that, and more, back to kind of an earlier point you made about the international bodies. You know, there is kind of a reflexive response from Congress anyway, if they perceive some overreach in a certain area or a mandate from international bodies to come impose regulation here in the U.S. So there's that dynamic that's going on as well.
I do want to get to Brexit. Before that, Steph, I want to ask you, you know, we talked a little bit about top-down and regulatory agenda, and Margaret talked about her clients, et cetera. So FINRA is a unique organization. So what, and I know Robert's been here just over a year now, and I know he did a listening tour when he first got here, went around to see a lot of the members and so on. So what are you hearing from the members of FINRA about the regulatory environment? What do they see? What are they pressing most for from FINRA's perspective?
Well, Robert did a 360, and that's come in a number of different ways. In the listening tour, we've also put out multiple notices for comment to try to engage the industry and give us messages as to what we can do better, what they're looking for, just like you said. I think one of the key takeaways is that they want more involvement, and we do have a lot of places within the rulemaking process and the policy process where they can be involved, but I think we're looking to see how we can do that even better and how we can get more engagement and more involvement. But if you take a normal policy initiative, we start out with our standing committees and we vet that with them often multiple times before it even makes its way out the door to a notice for comment. And then once it goes out for comment, we get even more perspective and insight. And oftentimes it goes multiple times out for comment before it makes its way over to the SEC, which then it gets an additional round of comment there. But I think that's something we're really looking to do even more of and find more ways to engage and get viewpoints before a rule becomes official. Because I think if we can craft it in a good way before it gets into the rule stage, that really benefits everybody.
What's the hottest button now that FINRA's dealing with right now from these members? What would be the hottest issue? Is there one single one, or?
I think there's a lot of issues right now.
Give me one. Give me two. So yeah, they're just it's all over. So okay.
I think there's a lot of different things that are that we're hearing from firms, but it's good. I mean, I think I think it's good that we're hearing things from them and understanding what's worrying them and what's keeping them up at night.
It's never been a quiet constituency, so I'm
no,
not surprised.
exactly.
So. All right, so let's flick to Brexit for a second, because I do want to ask the question. So the UK has to engage in a very, very involved process to exit the EU, and that's going to require a lot of new deals and agreements being worked out, et cetera. So obviously that's going to affect, firms here and so on. So there's a lot of implications, but what, on the regulatory front, was anything that happens between the UK government and EU, how is that going to play out in the policymakers' minds here in the U.S.? If that makes sense, that question. So.
Oh, gosh, so many ways. So there's the whole concept that financial regulation in Europe is coming out of the EU, right? We all know that. And many of those directives, you have to decide, do they go away? Or is there going to be an extension, an automatic bring down into British law? What's that going to look like? But most importantly, for our clients, is it going to happen on time?
Right.
So positioning yourself for what, ranging from a soft Brexit to a hard Brexit makes a huge difference in how, as a business, you make a decision on what's next. So what's next strategically, what's next operationally, what's next geographically. And let's not forget what's next in the market, which way is the market going. And in the derivative space, just as a small example of what's old is new is old, when Dodd-Frank hit and all the new rules came around regulation, there was a requirement to upgrade all your contracts, all your ISDAs, with your derivatives counterparties. It's a huge undertaking because you had to find them. Let's just figure out where are they, and then you had to figure out what do they say, and then the industry engaged in a whole lot of solutioning around how to make it quicker and easier, but most importantly, thorough. Last week there was an article in the media about the enforceability of your contracts in the UK. If Brexit happens, are your uncleared derivatives contracts going to remain enforceable, or do you have to novate them, right? So sorry to use lawyer words in a business room, but do you have to novate them? Do you have to go to each and every one of your thousands and thousands of trades and counterparties and enter into all new agreements? So if the answer to that is maybe, and Brexit is in how many months? Right. Do you start now? Do you wait? What do you do? So from just take that business problem or take that regulatory problem and try to operationalize it in your business, there's lots to think through.
Don, you're shaking your head.
Well, no, the only thing I'll add at sort of a higher altitude level is we've gone through a decade of growth in European securities regulation, much of which was driven by London. London's fingerprints are on a lot of what is legacy EU securities regulation. And London, has as prime directive maintaining its status as the global capital marketplace it is, without having funds flow into the continent. From a game theory perspective, that means the negotiations you have to do have to have stability rather than uncertainty as the underlying lesson. So I think there's a lot of room for working out a deal, but when you look at the volume of what you have to accomplish, it's not that any one project is going to be all that hard to accomplish. I think there's lots of negotiating room, but there are just so many things on the table. Getting that work done is the frightening part.
So there's a couple of thoughts. Looking at it at a 30,000-foot level, there's a regulatory pendulum that swings back and forth. And we had, post-Reagan, 2 decades of deregulation, sort of the golden age of Western-style laissez-faire free market capitalism that came to a crashing halt in 2008 with massive injections of capital from the government into the capital markets, opening of the discount window at the Fed, all of the ways that the government responded to the credit crisis ushered in a decade of sort of state-managed capitalism, if you will. And my contention is that Brexit and Trump have begun a new era that is going to be characterized by competition among nation states on the basis of regulation. That's one dimension of it, but the other dimension is the permanent international overlay that I mentioned earlier, and that's why I refer to it as 3-dimensional chess game. But within that, with the US and the UK, you have a common language, a common law-based legal system, a common appreciation of capital markets. More than 90% of derivatives trades occur in London and New York. So in that new dynamic, the EU is sort of odd man out, right? They don't have unified capital markets. They don't have a retail investor base. They have institutional investors, very large ones, sovereign wealth funds, the Norwegians, the Danes, and others, but they have a very progressive social agenda as opposed to a focus on sort of the creative destruction that our markets are focused on. And I think that's going to play out not immediately for two reasons. One is that the Brits have to show the Europeans that they're just as committed to regulation as part of the negotiations. But legally, they can't do anything until March of 2019 when they're no longer legally part of the EU. At that point, I think we'll see a series of bilateral agreements, and that cooperation that we're going to see emerging between the US and the UK is frankly going to ensure that New York and London remain the dominant financial centers in the world.
You know what's interesting about that deregulatory swing is this one, just as a matter, it feels like it swung back so fast it hit you in the head. You know, let's get rid of all the regulations, and that's become the mantra, and that's fine, and I completely agree. I've been in this business a long time too. It does swing back and forth. But this time, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, well, this is the first time it's swung back in its usual way, but in a very different business environment. So what's so different about the business environment? It's really been the subtext of every single panel, and that's the disintermediation coming from all the technology out there. And so let's say I'm a large financial institution with legacy systems, footprints, people, regulation. I'm Gulliver trying to travel forward and make profits, and little Uber of the financial institution keeps running up and of the financial markets keeps running up and trying to pluck off my business and my business areas. And I realize this is capital markets focused, but watch with interest the FinTech charter and the OCC debate about chartering new FinTechs as banks, which is definitely something the OCC is looking to do, and the blowback from the New York DFS on, oh no, you don't. And one of the things to think about, again, we're in a nice, wonderful university, so we can have these thoughts, is the theory of regulation. Is it a sword or is it a shield? And which one is it? And for financial institutions, sometimes it's a sword and you want someone to just stop hitting you with it, and sometimes it's a shield. And it helps you create the space in your market and in your environment. It's not, I'm in Washington, so hopefully no one will throw a tomato at me. It's not altogether bad, depending on your perspective. But again, it's not altogether good. So it'll be fascinating to see how this rolls.
And it does roll. So with that, let's take questions from the audience. So again, 2 mics. If anyone has one. Otherwise, we have plenty more to talk about. Oh, Jim. I knew Jim. I should have said anyone besides Jim who wants to ask a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me put you on the spot. Let's suppose that we somehow the 33, 34, 36, 38, 40, 75, 96, and 2010, et cetera, Act suddenly disappeared, and you're handed a clean sheet of paper to basically change the overall legislative foundations of U.S. financial regulation. So if you were the czar and you could create any kind of regulatory structures you wanted at all in the United States, you have infinite power, infinite flexibility, what would you do?
Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to take that one.
Go ahead.
That's easy.
You all have to answer. You all
So,
have to answer. But
In the wake of Sarbanes-Oxley, there were a series of reports about how to preserve U.S. competitiveness in global markets. There was the Bloomberg-Schumer report, Hal Scott at Harvard had one, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce had one, Treasury had its blueprint. The last in the series was the G30 report, chaired by Paul Volcker, that all essentially made the same set of recommendations. Merge the SEC and the CFTC, consolidate the bank regulators, move toward more principles-based regulation. And what's remarkable is that despite that body of work, Dodd-Frank, with the exception of getting rid of OTS, did none of it. So I'd go back to what they were recommending.
And Treasury didn't recommend consolidating, at least in this most recent report either. more coordination they talked about, but that's also kind of telling where they're at. Of course, it's difficult logistically just to do that, since several committees in Congress would have to be jockeying over who gets jurisdiction over the new consolidated regulator or regulators. But yeah, I tend to agree with Dan. You wouldn't have this many regulators in the ideal world.
Yeah. As Jim well knows, you can't answer that question except by sound bites. So, we're all just picking things. Yeah, I think we heard in prior panels that the mom and pop or the retail investor is in a different place today than ever before because of technology, because of things like that. I've always thought that securities regulation and most of the statutes you mentioned are really, in the end, designed to limit sales pressure, directed at people who have a hard time resisting sales pressure on their own. I would be building a fiduciary-based system of retail investor protection, and alternatively go with wholesale deregulation outside that space. Really focus our attention on sales pressure, because if products aren't sold to people, they're not going to become a big problem. People aren't going to choose bad stuff simply because they're sitting at their computer. It's a sales practice. So I think if you could build sales practice regulation at its core, you could find lots of ways to deregulate the rest.
I'm actually almost a lifetime regulator. I had like 4 years where I wasn't a regulator. And I do agree, I think we have too many regulators. I think there are ways to consolidate, and I think that we hear this from firms a lot, that they have so many different regulators coming in on so many different topics, and I do think we can do better as a nation, in how we organize our regulation. I actually also am, even though I write rules for a living, I'm a fan of principles, and I think a lot of firms actually, they say they like principles, but then when you put out a principle, they want to know exactly how to implement it and what are the specifics.
Give me the
on it.
rules to that principle. Right?
But I do think that framework could work well. So fewer regulators and more of a principle-based approach.
Margaret, would you add?
So just in the capital market space, I hear you on investor protection as being the core purpose of at least where regulation began, right? Investor protection. But so much of what's going on in the capital market space is black box. It's automated. And I thank you for not asking us, what do we worry about 5 years from now?
We still have 4 minutes.
But I spent most of the day really thinking, okay, what am I going to say? And it's not. I don't mean the traditional black box. I don't mean the box stuff with algos. I mean having gone in and built algo risk management programs, or having gone in and tried to work in a capital markets shop on how are you managing risk in this electronic trading environment. This doesn't go back to how do you rewrite the laws, but how to make sure that there's not cross-competency silos. So what do I mean by that? I know how to trade, let's say, and I came from the land of voice or open outcry. I know how to trade, but now I need to somehow use my electronic interface, and someone's got to code it. So that's definitely not going to be me. It's going to be a really smart coder that came out of a different part of this institution. And so we'll sit together and they'll code them, and then someone will check it. Now, who's going to check it? Another coder. And did they come out of the trading shop? Not really, because it just doesn't really happen. That's a unicorn, a coder who can trade. And then they exist. They exist. I've met a few, but they don't really exist. And so instead you have the legacy operations of all these people with these different competencies trying to figure out, so what's the risk in this black box, and what am I going to do about it? I don't think, so this is probably going back to principles-based. You can regulate it, in the sense that there's nothing like a good regulation to get management to fund, right? When do I get a call? It's when there's a big regulation out and some non-frontline business needs to put something in place and suddenly they've got funding. So there is a sort of business imperative, I think, driven by regulation, but at the end of the day, it's principles that can get your thinking across.
So it's a great point because you say, so business imperatives driven by regulation, but as we've talked about, regulation tends to react a lot. So I'll end on this one, which is, we haven't talked a lot about on this panel, but Equifax and things like that. Cybersecurity, how you feel, because that gets a lot of people very nervous, and a lot of people who are even on the sidelines right now in the equity markets or whatever, they all got banking accounts, they all got checking accounts. So what's your thoughts on the agenda can get sidetracked, or not sidetracked, but the priorities change with these kinds of cyber issues that are happening? Can that take over the regulatory agenda and reaction and so on and so forth? So, just anyone? Joe?
Certainly been a focus since Equifax and other breaches that we've witnessed. And the Equifax one, obviously, just one of the more recent ones. There have been many before that.
Right.
This one is just how big it is.
How big it is.
And also
And growing,
how
it
many,
seems to grow.
Yeah, it seems to
Yeah,
grow.
in a few days. Yeah.
And also how many people probably in this country didn't even know who Equifax was and that they could possibly even have their information. I mean, if you take out a loan, to a mortgage or something, yes, then you might know, but your average person probably doesn't a whole lot. So I think it brings to light to a lot of people like, wow, my information really is out there in a lot of places I didn't even know, beyond social media and personal information, and that's what gets people nervous. So yeah, I think this is one of those areas that Congress is focusing on more now, not just hearing-wise, but I think committees that had competed before, had competing versions of how to deal with it, are now starting to talk a little bit, at least is my observation so far. We'll see if it results in any statutory change or in how it's governed, and it's really hard to legislate as well, not just the fact of legislating, but how do you solve the issue? You really, it's really not possible.
At the risk of stating the obvious, the fears, the kinds of cyber breaches that we could imagine haven't happened yet. And everything we've been talking about today is a deregulatory, growth-oriented agenda in the face of a stock market that is riding high, that good economic numbers, whatever's going on in politics, the economics in this country are doing pretty well. Change that. A cyber breach that actually affects the security of people's money, not just their privacy, their money. You would find the political environment changing on a dime.
That is a really important point, which is, we've talked a lot about deregulation in the current environment, but it is fundamental that well-regulated markets are an essential ingredient to investor confidence to commit capital. If you lose that confidence in the rule of law and private property rights, then you don't have markets. And the danger with these kind of security breaches is that people, go into a shell or a bunker. And that's why I think it's important that, as examples, Jack Reed, the longtime chairman of the Security Subcommittee, has a bill now that would mandate disclosure of the cyber expertise on corporate boards, right? But what he's getting at is this idea that there need to be policies in these organizations policies and procedures for how you're going to respond when there is the inevitable attack, because it's going to happen.
It's going to happen.
And how you respond to it is critical in that first 24-hour period. And I think the big lesson I take from Equifax is that it is a case study in how not to respond.
Yeah, sure.
And I applaud the SEC and the Hill in rethinking CAT based on a lot of these cybersecurity concerns that have been happening. I think it would be easy to just say, oh, it's been approved and the PII is in there, let's move forward, and they really are taking these concerns, they're taking them very seriously, and I think it's good that they're taking a step back and really evaluating this risk in light of what the needs are in CAT.
4 hearings, 3 days, all on Equifax last week, very bipartisan, right? So we can talk about a dysfunctional Congress, but they were not dysfunctional last week when it came to the messaging coming from each of the senators. And they were definitely in their swim lanes, but it was the same lane. And why is that? Because consumer protection is bipartisan. Every consumer is a voter. Every Social Security number is, at the core of the authentication strategies, not just in the financial services business,
everything.
but in many, many, many businesses. And so when we talk about this among ourselves, we think of that particular incident as having tentacles that reach far and deep into the financial services industry, of course, but it also gives Congress an opportunity to do something in the financial services space that, that's good for voters, right? And the privacy laws, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, 1991, that was the last time we had, so that was the beginning of my Federal Reserve career, just to, please don't do the math, but that was the last time we had federal privacy regulation, and it's still out there. That's the law of the land in the federal privacy. So
The internet wasn't even really around
no,
then.
I don't even know if they had computers. I had a typewriter. So anyway, lots to do.
So we'll talk about that next year.
Next
So I
year.
appreciate it. So let's thank the panel for their input and insights.